BTEC Applied Human Biology, A2, the Nervous System Summary. So the two main divisions of the nervous system are the central nervous system, or CNS, and the peripheral nervous system, or PNS. The somatic nervous system is the voluntary nervous system, and the autonomic nervous system is the involuntary nervous system. The central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system includes the sensory and motor neurons that connect the central nervous system to the rest of the body. The divisions of the autonomic nervous system, or ANS, are the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. The parasympathetic nervous system calms the body, conserving its energy for sleep, relaxation, and acetylcholine is released and acts on the SAN to decrease heart rate. The sympathetic nervous system is for the fight or flight response, increasing its energy in stressful situations using noradrenaline neurotransmitters, and it acts in the SAN to accelerate heart rate. Neurons are the scientific name for a nerve cell, so it is a neuron. The neuron structure, it has an axon, which is a long nerve fibre of a neuron which carries a nerve impulse. There are dendrites, which are extensions from the cell body which connect with neighbouring neurons. Schwann cells are specialised cells associated with the axons of which myelinated neurons forms the insulating myelin sheath, shown here in orangey yellow. The myelin sheath is a fatty insulating layer around some axons produced by the Schwann cells. And then the gaps between the myelin sheath are called nodes of Ranvier, the gaps between the Schwann cells that enable saltatory conduction. A motor neuron sends impulses from the spinal cord, or CNS, to the effector, which can be a muscle or gland. Sensory neuron. A sensory neuron sends impulses from a sensory receptor to a relay neuron in the spinal cord, or CNS. A relay neuron carries messages from one part of the CNS to another. A reflex arc. Receptor is a specialised cell that responds to changes in the surrounding environment. An effector is a muscle or gland. An action potential is a change in electrical potential along the membrane of a nerve or muscle cell, commonly known as nerve impulse. A glial cell. These are cells that provide support for neurons. Reflex arc. Stimulus, receptor, sensory neuron, relay neuron, motor neuron, and effector that are involved in a quick response to trigger an action potential. So, there is, in a reflex arc, there is stimulus, receptor, sensory neuron, which synapses with a relay neuron in the spinal cord, which will then synapse with a motor neuron to effectors, which carries out a response. Action potential. This is a neural impulse, a brief electrical charge that travels down an axon. So you can see here, this at number 1 is where the stimulus starts, and the stimulus causes sodium channels to open. If enough sodium flows into the axon then and reaches the threshold value, then lots of sodium channels open, and this causes the membrane to become positive, known as depolarized. At the top of the action potential, which is around plus 30 millivolts, the sodium channels close and the potassium channels open. Therefore, potassium goes out of the axon. There is a slight overshoot where the potassium channels are slow to close, which causes it to become more negative than resting. And then eventually at number 5, the resting potential, the sodium-potassium pump, kicks back in. So the sodium-potassium pump is a carrier protein that uses ATP to actively transport 3 sodium ions out of a cell and 2 potassium ions into the cell. Resting potential, the state of the neuron when not firing a neural impulse. The neuron is polarised and negative inside at -70 millivolts. Depolarisation. When stimulated, voltage-gated sodium ion channels open and more sodium ions diffuse into the neuron. The inside of the membrane becomes positive at +35 millivolts. Repolarisation. Sodium channels close and potassium voltage-gated channels become activated and open, causing potassium to diffuse out of the cell for the membrane to repolarise. Hyperpolarisation. Potassium ion channels are slow to close, so there is a slight overshoot where too many potassium ions diffuse out of the neuron, so the potential difference is more negative than the resting potential. Definitions. Refractory period. The time following an action potential during which a new action potential cannot be initiated. Myelinated axons. Axons covered with myelin sheaths with gaps between them called nodes of Ranvier, and the transmission is much faster. Saltatory conduction. Rapid transmission of a nerve impulse along an axon, resulting from the action potential jumping from one node of Ranvier to another, skipping the myelin sheath regions of the membrane. Synapses. Presynaptic neuron. This conducts impulses towards the presynaptic knob. Synaptic vesicles are membrane-bound compartments where the neurotransmitter is kept. Neurotransmitters are chemical messages that cross the synaptic cleft. Mitochondrion is an organelle found in large numbers in the presynaptic neuron, which synthesize neurotransmitters. The synaptic cleft is the tiny gap that separates the axon terminal of one neuron from the dendrite terminal of the next neuron. How neurotransmitters work. They are released, then diffuse across the synaptic cleft. They bind to receptors in the postsynaptic neuron. If enough neurotransmitter binds, an action potential will be generated in the postsynaptic neuron. Synaptic transmission steps. 1. Depolarization of the presynaptic membrane. 2. Calcium channels open and calcium ions enter the synaptic knob. 3. Calcium ions cause the synaptic vesicles to fuse with the presynaptic membrane and release the neurotransmitter or acetylcholine. The neurotransmitter diffuses across the synaptic cleft, and then the neurotransmitter attaches to receptors on the postsynaptic membrane. This causes sodium ions to enter the prosynaptic neuron, leading to depolarization. Neurotransmitters and drugs at synapses. Parkinson's disease is a disorder of the central nervous system that affects movement due to lack of dopamine, often including tremors. Serotonin is a neurotransmitter that affects hunger, sleep, arousal and mood. Lack of serotonin can cause depression. Drugs on the synapse. They can either stimulate or inhibit neurotransmitter release, stimulate or block postsynaptic receptor molecules, or inhibit reuptake.